Good evening, Captain Matt Edwards here, retired, with the next installment of the Observation Post Weekly Report, brought to you by yours truly. Now, it's pretty cold here in my basement where I shoot my videos and play my games and stuff on my computer, so I got a long sleeve shirt that happens to be like Canadians, although I don't watch it that much these days. I am a Habs fan. Like it or not. Anyway, without further ado, from my numbered list that I have done up, number 164, the 2016 top-up of the Service Income Support Insurance Plan by Income Replacement Benefit. Public knowledge about potential conflict between Veterans Affairs Canada and the Department of National Defence with respect to clawback priority. Now, what I'm talking about is the same thing I've been talking about a lot the last few years. If they are allowed to claw back, say, the Canada Pension Plan Disability or the Canadian Forces Superannuation Act, who will get priority over the other payment? Because, you know, they both claim that they can take into account at 100% either of those two alleged benefits. So the Service Income Support Insurance Plan, for example, in the case of leading seaman retired Sean Corrine, they deduct the value of his Canadian Forces Superannuation Act, and then they take into account his Canada Pension Plan Disability. So they reduce the payment and therefore save money for the government. Now then, the other alleged benefit also takes the same two things into account. Now, anybody with a brain ought to think that they can't both take that into account at the same time. If the Service Income Support Insurance Plan makes a claim against the Canadian Forces Pension or the Canada Pension Plan Disability, then Veterans Affairs Canada has to be foreclosed from taking any reduction or clawback for the same thing. Now, what makes this matter worse is that they have this thing called a program arrangement where they ought to have thought of this back in 2006. So back in 2006, I've mentioned this a dozen times, I'm sure. Back in 2006, in a thing called the Canada Gazette, which is the newspaper that Canada publishes laws in because laws had to be promulgated, spread out. They can't pass a law and keep it secret and then prosecute you for passing a secret law. So the Canada Gazette was published, and they talked about the new Veterans Charter, as it was colloquially called. It was really called the Canadian Forces Members and Veterans Reestablishment Act, CFVMRA or something like that. But it was commonly known by its nickname, the New Veterans Charter. Now, what they said about that, to keep costs low, they said we have a prudent safety margin because the earnings loss benefit will be taking into account other income, such as the Canadian Forces Superannuation Act pension, which is a retirement pension, by the way, an earned benefit because you put away money for the future, for when you don't work, and the Canada Pension Plan. Now, at the time of this writing, the Canada Gazette, in April of 2006, that was around the same time that they wrote the program arrangement. Now, they ought to have thought about the claim that the Service Income Support Insurance Plan, that takes those two things into account, and they never should have mentioned it in the Canada Gazette. Because Veterans Affairs Canada does not have a prudent safety margin. They have no safety margin because all they're doing is creating misery for veterans by taking into account the same thing that the Department of National Defence already took into account to save money for the taxpayer. So Veterans Affairs takes it into account too, so they save $2 for every dollar that is paid in Canadian Forces pension or the Canada Pension Plan Disability. Now, this is why I say they're going to get caught eventually. You cannot do that to anyone, but especially to someone who became injured in the service to Canada. You have to treat those people special and not as less deserving. Okay? Anybody who puts their life on the line for us, they deserve extra, not less. Okay? Anyway, number 165. the Department of National Defence, SISIP, and the Canadian Forces Ombudsman versus the Veterans Affairs Canada Office of the Veterans Ombudsman. I wrote this months ago and I got to get my head around what I was thinking. But hopefully my note to myself, program arrangement means no real difference. But the Canadian Forces Ombudsman and the Office of the Veterans Ombudsman refused to hear complaints, citing that a complaint should go to the other ombudsman. Now, I've come across this personally many times. I've called the Canadian Forces Ombudsman. I've explained to them the problem, and then they say, well, you know, thanks for calling, but you should call the Veterans Ombudsman, because that sounds to us like that's not our problem that we got to help you with, but that's the Veterans Ombudsman problem. Now, I then call the Veterans Ombudsman. I explain the problem to their agent, and then they say, well, you know, that's really a Department of National Defence Canadian Forces Ombudsman, and you get batted around like a tennis ball, which is exactly like the same thing that happened back in 2015 when they had announced an increase for the service income, for the earnings loss benefit. For the earnings loss benefit, they were going to pay a Class A and B reserve veteran the same earnings loss benefit as a disabled regular force veteran. So when I heard about that, I contacted Manulife. And I said, hey guys, what are you going to do for the Department of National Defence veterans? Because the other side of the house, in the Veterans Affairs Canada side, they are going to increase the payment to 75%, and so, you know, why should I get less than a regular force person if I'm with the Department of National Defence? If I was with the Veterans Affairs Canada Department, then I get this increase. What are you going to do about it? Well, they said, you need to contact Veterans Affairs Canada because that's their program and not ours. So I contacted Veterans Affairs Canada, and they said, you're on their program at the Department of National Defence, and you're not on our program, so tough titty, basically. Now, that's the same thing I was just talking about. Both agencies are trying to shunt the problem to another agency when they ought to fix it, because that was the whole idea of the program arrangement. If they're going to set up two programs that essentially do the same thing, then they ought to cooperate. They ought to have the same definition of disability. They ought to have communication. They have this stupid program arrangement, and I'm not going to pull any punches. They should never have done it. It's a fake document. Why do I say it's fake? Because there was no consideration or money that changed hands. So basically, the Department of National Defence and the Department of Veterans Affairs sat down and screwed the disabled Canadian Forces veteran out of their compensation for injury, because the earnings loss benefit takes into account the service income support insurance plan and reduces the compensation for injury when it shouldn't do it. Now, why shouldn't it do it? Because A, the common law don't do it. If you got hurt in an accident and the other person was driving a car and you were walking down the sidewalk and you got hit and put into a wheelchair, now they cannot say to the judge, you know, before I pay compensation to this person I put in the wheelchair, I want to take into account the service income support insurance plan insurance or such like, and therefore I should get a break on the amount of damages that I had to put that person back into place that he was before I put him in the fucking wheelchair. So you take the insurance into account. Now the judge would look at Buddy and say, go fuck off, in polite legal terms, because it has been the law since 1875 that a non-indemnity and contributory insurance shall not reduce the amount of compensation paid to a person who has been injured by another. Now, what makes the government think that it can take into account a non-indemnity and contributory payment like the service income support insurance plan? Well, they think they're the government and they can do what they like. Now, I used to be a civil servant. I used to be a soldier. I'm not an anarchist. I believe in good government. Now, good government means following the rules. Good government means that if you have the jurisdiction under the Constitution for property and civil rights, like the provinces, then you, as the provinces, make rules about property and civil rights. Now that's where the Bradburn rule comes in provincial court. But the federal government does not have jurisdiction over property and civil rights like insurance. So it cannot make rules about common law damages or its equivalent unless it just simply follows what the provinces do, what the common law does. I mean, if it makes a law and the law doesn't stray from what's normal, then who's going to care if they strayed outside their jurisdiction? The problem comes when you have people that have been trying to basically screw over the injured party forever, the insurance companies. So in order to allow damages to be taken into account or the insurance to be taken into account, they have invented a term in a 1984 case called Sun Life versus Gibson, Ontario Superior Court, and the judge ruled that the long-term disability being paid was partial indemnity. Instead of saying it was not an indemnity, a non-indemnity payment, he said it was partial indemnity because it replaced 70% of the person's wages from where they used to work at CRA before they had a car accident. The problem is a very pragmatic one, and if the money is a partial indemnity for the loss of the income, then the damages have to be reduced, and basically the judge would be overturning the Bradburn rule, right? But they have to have a good reason to turn over what is settled law. There is no reason to turn over that, because basically you'd be saying, in the Boatworelli versus Flanagan, Ontario Court of Appeal, 1973 case, the judge said when they wanted to take into account some of these pensions and insurances, I can see no equitable reason why a person's earned benefits from employment should reduce the damages for the person who did the other person wrong. Think about how sensible that is. Why should the person who caused the injury save money at the expense of the person they injured? It's ludicrous. The whole idea is ludicrous. But somehow they have twisted things, and they take the slightest little, okay, I'll say compensation principle. Okay, the principle of compensation for personal injury is that you cannot be compensated more than 100% of what you lost. Okay? But the other side of the coin for that compensation principle is that you cannot lose any compensation until you have achieved the 100% of your loss. Now that brings you to a question of how much have you lost? If someone is injured, a personal injury, let's say I'll use Paul Franklin. Okay, Paul Franklin, over in Afghanistan, 2005, suicide bomber, blew off two of his legs. How much are his legs worth? Nobody knows. Because nobody knows the value of a human life or the value of a limb or two, then you have to put it in the contracts based on whatever you put into the contract. You don't really know what the value of the person is, so you can't indemnify a person for a personal injury to an exact science. It's impossible. Okay? So basically you get long-term disability like SISIP, the Service Income Support Insurance Plan, Policy 901-102, or the Sun Life policy that I get, Policy 12,500G. Now somebody puts into the contract a formula. Now we had no say about the formula that got put into the contract, but the Sun Life policy is 70% of your wages. The Service Income Support Insurance Plan is 75%. Now, that is a formula, and according to a 1963 Scottish Union Win Insurance Ontario Court of Appeal case, they said that accident and life insurance policies can never be one of indemnity. Never. Ever. And the reason, as I said, is that you can't put a value on a person's life. You can't tell exactly what it's worth. Now, I might have went on too long on that topic. Let me see what I was saying. Basically, though, it's human nature, really. I almost don't blame the ombudsmen at both the Department of National Defense and the Veterans Affairs, except that they're not doing their duty, their job. They are getting paid by taxes, and they're supposed to do their duty. If their job is to investigate complaints, when you get a complaint, you're not supposed to refuse to accept it. You're not. Now, maybe you need more than a few. With one person always complaining like me, maybe they just don't like to hear me. The Canadian Forces Ombudsman, I called up one time and I got a different person than usual, and they were talking to me, and I was telling them about a problem, and then I heard another voice on the line, and then she came back on and said, I've been told we are not to engage with you. Now, how are they doing their job if they've been told not to talk to Captain Retired Matt Edwards? Now, my response to that, not that it really got me anywhere, was I called the Canadian Forces, the Canadian Human Rights Commission. And I said, hey, is the Canadian Forces Ombudsman covered under your jurisdiction? Because without jurisdiction to look into it, I couldn't allege discrimination. They said yes. Well, I said, these people refuse to talk to me, and I assume it's because I have obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, a mental health problem, which means that I'm always going to them, even though I know I shouldn't, because it's a waste of fucking time. But, I keep going to them, hoping that eventually they'll do their duty and develop a conscience. But, they said to me that, we've been told not to engage with you, which I tend to think that they're discriminating against me based on my mental disability. But, I'm not going to put a complaint in right now. I'll think about it. Do I want to bother, because I've referred things to you guys before, and you never looked into it, even though it was an open shutting case. Now, that was one example. Anyway, carrying on, because, well, I don't want to be here all day. You don't want to be here all day. Number 166 on my list, the supplementary retirement benefit lawsuit. I plan to review and provide input. Now, I plan to provide input, but maybe the lawyers might not want to hear from Captain Retired Matt Edwards. That happened at the top class action. I called up to the law firm representing the plaintiff, and I said to them, when you guys are getting this settlement done, make sure, I used to work for Canada Revenue Agency for 16 years. I was in the military too. I said, make sure that any damages are not taxed, because damages are not supposed to be taxed. And Buddy isn't a lawyer. He's one that works there. He's some kind of assistant. And he said, well, I'm sure our lawyers are aware of that. Whatever. And he's given me a bit of a lecture talking down to. I said, now listen here, buddy. I didn't need to call you guys, but I figured I'd try to help you out. Because if you allow the class to pay taxes, if you force the class to pay taxes on damages, then I think your law firm might be sued for professional malpractice, because everybody knows that a capital payment of damages for an injury is not taxes. And then I hung up. So look at what I get for trying to help people out, right? I'm not part of that class action. I wasn't. But I was trying to help out the class to make sure, like Tom just mentioned something about I'll go back to the SISIP class action, which Tom was a part of. Now, they were paid damages, which is capital, because the government broke the contract. They paid a lump sum payment to settle a lawsuit. They didn't pay income for services rendered. So it should not have been paid, it should not have been subject to taxes. So I don't know if they just assumed it had to be taxed. But I think McInnes Cooper are liable for the damages in that the taxes were paid on a lump sum when it shouldn't have been taxed, because a periodic payment might have attracted taxes, but a lump sum legally could not be taxed because of Section 6(1)(f) of the Income Tax Act. Okay? It states that a payment, in order to be taxed under that section, must be periodic. So that's a threshold question, okay? If you get a payment and it's every month and it's for 10 years or life or whatever, then you might have to pay taxes. under Section 61F. But you take the government to court, you win a case, you get paid a lump sum, one-time payment, whatever it is, $1 or $10 million, then that payment cannot be taxed under Section 61F. Now, they might try to tax it under a different section, but they can't tax it under the normal section that they use for SISIP. Okay? They just can't legally do it. That didn't stop them, though. Okay? That's the problem. Everybody assumes the government is okay because it's the government and they wouldn't do it. Now, I am reluctantly coming to think, one of my biggest problems is that I always think that it's the government, they'll fix it eventually. I'm starting to lose that faith because, for example, the Canada Pension Plan disability that I get has been deducted from the SISIP policy while I had it, and my Sun Life policy while I still have it, and my public service pension that I still have, and my reserve force pension that I still have. So these 4 payments were reduced for my Canada Pension Plan disability for the past 7 years. So they never fixed it. I've been telling them about all this time, and I figured, why should I have to pay a lawyer for something this obvious? They all can't take it into account. Same as what I was saying before about the double dip clawback. Yeah, I see your point. They compensate you for... See, they have a couple of different things, and I haven't reviewed it lately, but there's... I'm trying to remember now. Anyway, I won't go touch it because I like to make sure I know what I'm talking about before I open it. It might not seem that way, but it is. I'm not a loose cannon like people might think, right? Anyway, number 167. And Tom, you're watching? It's about you. Tom and taxes. The qualifying retroactive lump sum payment tax is insane, but can he sue? Now, my point about that is that even though the government did all of the people that had inordinate, really high, strange taxes on their lump sum payment that they shouldn't have paid taxes on anyway, the government brought in a thing in the 90s to try to help people who got lump sums pay less taxes. They called a QRLSP, a qualifying retroactive lump sum payment. Now, if you got a payment in 1 year, it might, in that 1 year, drive up your taxes into a different tax bracket. So the idea was to save people money, because instead of paying like 50% in that 1 year, maybe they'd only have to pay 30% in the other years. So it was supposed to be a help, right? It was supposed to assist people with their taxes. But some fucking yahoo convinced the government that they were out the time value of the taxes that weren't paid on time. So they decided to pay Treasury bill plus 2% compound daily interest to be charged against the taxes that were due in the year it was due, even though it was outside your control if somebody fucked you over like they did the SISIP class. So this resulted in Tom's case, for example. He had $145,000 after this and after that, and adjustments here and there. There was $145,000 in taxable income on line 260 of his tax return. But on line 435 of his tax return, they put $160,000, $15,000 in the fucking income they said was owed in taxes. Now, how the fuck can you owe more than you made? Now, I say made, and I'm cringing because he didn't make it. He was paid compensation for the breach of contract. But even if it was income, no one should ever be taxed at more than what was listed on line 260. That is fucking insane. It just is. Now, what kind of remedy can not only Tom, but all of the class that had this happen to them, because it might not have happened to everybody. What had to happen, if it had to be put onto, I think it's a T1198 or something like that. There's a form that CRA puts all the money into each separate year. Then they're supposed to see if you get better treatment under the normal rules or you get better treatment under the QRLSP tax rules. So they're supposed to give you A and B and let you get the lesser of to be the tax you owe. Now, there was a lady, Therese, I don't know her last name, I can't remember, but she's in Quebec. Now, when she sent me her taxes to look at, it appeared to me that CRA took the one that gave them the most taxes and not the one that gave them the least taxes, which is the whole idea of the QRLSP program. It's nuts. So, can people sue if you have something fucked up like that? The government would try to say that, we didn't do anything wrong, we just followed the law. Well, who wrote that law? Well, we did. Well, what was the intent of that law? The intent of the law was to give people a break. Well, are you giving people a break like Corporal Retired Tom Anderson? Are you giving him a break when you ask him to pay $160,000 when he only had $145,000 on line 260? Are you helping him out there? Well, you're not. That's my fucking point. Anybody with a conscience and a brain, they wouldn't do this to anybody. But if you look at someone who lost 2 legs in 1994, if I recall, in Serbia, while he was serving Canada, you do that to him, you're going to hell, as far as I'm concerned. You're fucking evil. I better watch or I'll get too riled up. Okay, number 168, my mess. SISIP cut me off in 2017. They owe me a lot of money, I figure. A, they certified me as meeting the definition of total disability, yet they cut me off. All insurance is for peace of mind, not for saving money at my expense. See, this is the thing that everybody gets caught up in with legal technicalities with insurance. Insurance is supposed to be about fairness and equity. It's about utmost good faith on both the part of the insured and the insurer. Now, if you get cut off, or if, like again, hope you don't mind me using you for an example again, Tom, if they say that, we need to reduce your payment because you're getting a pension act. Now, how does that help you? How is that fair? So instead of relying on the legal technicality, because they put it into the contract that they wrote without consulting the Canadian Forces member, so they put this clawback, which is a form of tax, into the contract. Then they imposed that, and then someone should say, well, does this assist my peace of mind? Because insurance is supposed to provide me a peace of mind. I paid a premium, and if the risk happens, I have peace of mind that I'm going to be taken care of because I paid my good money as a premium, so that I will be covered if the risk happens. In the case of the service income support insurance, and the risk is disability. Now, they abused the class, and they said we're going to take into account the Pension Act. Forget the technical legalities of income and bullshit like that. Is it fair? Is it fair to take someone's indemnity for their injury and then reduce a non-indemnity payment? Because the payment from SISIP is a formula in a contract. The same thing as the clawback is part of that formula. So instead of looking at the legal technicalities, they should say, well, how is this fair? It isn't. So that's why they don't ask the question. Anyway, I only put in point A, even though I can come up with a half a dozen other points for myself, right? Like, okay, SISIP cut me off in 2017. So I got it from 2013 to 2017, 4 years. For the first year, the reason I went to Veterans Affairs in the first place, when I tried to go to them to get an earnings loss benefit through the rehabilitation program, was because Manulife SISIP DND wouldn't pay me. They wouldn't certify me as being hurt in service because that was what they said was holding them back in the policy. So again, there was no consultation with Captain Retired Matt Edwards, or I wouldn't have been retired at the time. When I was serving, they didn't consult with me and said, is it okay if we put into the policy a provision that you had to be injured in service in order to get your insurance? Because had they said that to me, I would have told them to take a flying fucking leap off a short ledge or some bridge, whatever that saying is. Because how is that to my benefit? If they put into the contract an additional provision that imposes a condition that's higher than one imposed on a Canadian Forces regular force member. A regular force member can get SISIP for injury on or off duty. A reservist can only get it for an injury on duty. Now, why is that there? I've speculated a bunch of times when I talked about it before. I think they might have thought it was simple because if you're on duty, you're getting paid. If you're getting paid, you should be covered. That might be the case. But the fact of the matter is you're supposed to get 24/7 coverage with insurance, generally. Okay? They're not supposed to say that you had to be injured on duty because, like I told them way back when I was starting to argue with the bastards, I said, listen, who takes care of injury on duty? The Department of National Defence or Veterans Affairs Canada? Well, Veterans Affairs Canada. So you put a provision in SISIP that you had to be hurt on duty, and that automatically excludes your insurance and shunts the person over to the other department. So they avoid payment. What a fucking scam these people are running, right? I mean, every twist, every turn, they can look at bending things, bending reality. They want things to be all in their favor, and they want everything to be against us, and they don't seem to realize that it puts them at risk of paying punitive damages. When you have a peace of mind insurance, you're supposed to get peace of mind. If someone don't give it to you, they can end up paying a lot more than just what they owe you, because they might get a slap on the wrist, a legal slap on the wrist, if the judge heard the case and then said, well, you know, your behavior is such high-handed and capricious that, you know, we need to send a message to the insurance community. So, you know, if you owe $100,000, we say you had to pay 5 times as much in order to remedy this case. Now, for one person, that might not be much, but if you had a big class and every one of them got 5 times, because it's always given as a quantum multiplicative multiplier of what you would have been paid anyway. Okay? So that's the risk that they're taking when they screw us over. Now, so far, they have evaded getting caught. I asked Dennis Manouche, why didn't he go after punitive damages? You know, I was chatting with him for a good time before, you know, he got tired of talking to me. And he said, well, you know, he didn't think it was fair to make the taxpayers pay more than, you know, just what they owed. Now, that might seem like a fair answer, but it means the next person coming along with a similar case has to go to court instead of being the government afraid to get punitive damages served against them again, which is the function of punitive damages. Then that lets the government kick the can down the road a bit and wait for the next case to come up. And they successfully got away with that in the Toth class action. That case was not really a human rights case. It was resolved on paper as a human rights case, but really it was about the Pension Act being used to reduce the earnings loss benefit, just like the Pension Act was being used to reduce the service income support insurance fund. Okay, last point. I'm getting a bit dried out here and my eyes are getting blurry again. Point number 169 on my list, and anybody who wants to look at the full list, I have a copy that I usually put into my files. Location on my group. Okay, I believe in total, upfront, you know, transparency. Canada Pension Plan / Canadian Forces Superannuation Act / Public Service Superannuation Act / no more / Cost of Living Allowance and clawbacks, in spite of the policy in SISIP Policy 901-102, Section 24B and 44B. Now, this is, I keep saying the same things over and over, and I hope people that have been watching me for a few years don't get too tired of it, okay? I was looking through the SISIP policy, and I saw that Section 44, because I was a reservist, Section 44B applied to me. I called up to Manulife, and I said, hey, Christopher, how much are you taking out, reducing my SISIP because of my Canada Pension Plan disability right now? He said $1,058. Well, I said, I guess you're in breach of the contract. Section 44B of the policy states that the cost of living allowance on a clawback shall not be considered income according to that contract term. Oh no, he said, there's a very complicated formula that the computer uses to determine this and determine that and blah, blah, fucking blah. I said, you hang the fuck on right here, my son. I don't care what the computer uses for the formula. If I want to see if you're abiding by the term in the contract, all I need to do is A, look at how much you're taking in now, and B, look at how much I was originally awarded, which was $1,017.94. And if the two are different, then you're in breach of the contract. Now, send me my money, I said, that you owe me because you can't take it into account. It's in the contract. A couple of weeks later, the same light bulb goes on over my head, and I thinks about the reserve force pension plan, and I calls up and goes for the same routine. But this time, because he had to call 2 weeks ago, he's a bit leery of me. And when I ask me the question, he tells me a different answer, like what it was, originally. And I said, I didn't ask what you started to take out back whenever. I said, what are you taking out right now for my reserve force pension plan, right as of this date? So he tells me, and again, they're doing the exact same thing, ignoring the contract. So I said, you're in breach of the contract again there, Christopher. You're not supposed to be taking into account the inflation clause because that's what's in the contract. His response, because I guess you're getting pissed off at me, nothing you can do about it anyway. You were part of the Manouche class action. I wasn't, really. I got a $33 payment. I don't know why I got it, but I wasn't part of class action. I don't get a pension act. So he says, you were part of the class action, and that was settled, and, as part of the settlement, no one can sue on the cost of living allowance because there was a second issue they added, and you're caught in debt. Well, I said, I'll see about that because I think you're wrong. So I called McKinnis Cooper. I think I spoke to Dan. Anyway, so I explained the situation. I said, by the way, I had to look it up to see exactly what the cost of living allowance problem that were discovered after the case was done. I had to look it up because it wasn't clearly identified. So I deduced it to be this. If a person was getting, say, $2,000 SISIP and $1,000 Pension Act pension, and then there was going to be a 2% increase on the SISIP, they were taking $2,000, take away the $1,000, and then they'd add the 2% cost of living factor to the SISIP to give you $20 extra. So your next year payment will be $1,020 instead of $1,000. But if they did it the way the contract stated, then they would have had to put 22% on the $2,000 before the clawback, and you'd have $2,040, and then take away the $1,000, and then you'd have $1,040, and then you'd have to, get more money. A $20 difference. That's exactly what it is. Well, I said, I got this other problem. I was talking to this fellow, Christopher Anderson at Manulife, and I was telling him about how, they're ignoring Section 24 and 44B of the policy, and then he told me I'm barred against suing them because I was part of the class action, which I wasn't. I said, what do you think of that? Oh, no, it was a totally different problem. Well, I said, that's not what I'm being told by Manulife. So this fucker at Manulife lied to me. He didn't want me to kick up a stink about this because everybody has this happen. Don't think they're just doing it to me. So they're doing it on the Sunlight policy. They're doing it on the Great West Life policy for the RSMP. They're doing it that VAC because the earnings loss benefit does the exact same thing. Now, instead of Section 24B and 44B of the SISIP policy in the Veterans Affairs legislation, they put it into the Veterans Wellbeing Act regulation, Section 27.3. So what did the government do in 2019? They repealed Section 27.3, all of Section 27 actually, which included the provision that excluded the inflation adjustment. So I have been talking to the Office of the Veterans Ombudsman about this, and the way he put it to me, he said, Matt, how does your allegation about the fact that the government was breaking the law on the cost of living adjustment being taken into account, how does that get affected by the fact that the government repealed that law on the 1st of April 2019? And he said it to me like he wanted to shock me and like put me in my place. And I said, Dwayne, Sounds to me like they made matters worse. Sounds to me like they didn't want to get caught, so they repealed the section before they could get caught for breaking that law. They've repealed that law, so no one can accuse them of breaking the law. It's gone. But you see, I never thought of it when I was talking to him, but I thought of it later. You can't retroactively cover it up. If there was a law in place that said they had to exclude the cost of living, and there was, from 2006 to 2019, there was a law that Veterans Affairs Canada was supposed to apply, and they were supposed to look at the increase for the cost of living, and if someone got a 10% increase in the Pension Act or the Canada Pension Plan or the Canadian Forces Pension, they were not allowed to touch the increase. So they were supposed to take into account the original award until you die. But they didn't do it. So they tried to cover it up, it seems. They covered it up by repealing that law. But they didn't repeal the part in their program arrangement. The Service Income Support Insurance Plan still forms the base, the most, of the compensation paid to a disabled veteran. So it pays on medical release 75 out of the 100% of the person's salary. Then Veterans Affairs Canada adds the other 15% to make up 90%. So the cost of living allowance being ignored should be in place for most of the money, but SISIP don't do it, remember? That's what started that racket with Christopher Anderson, the manager at Manulife. See, I think it's almost criminal what to do. They're trying to defraud disabled veterans. In the case of disabled veterans in reserves on SISIP, it's people that were hurt in service. That should be too shocking to even consider. But their whole, like, this is my last, I'll make a editorial comment, the government seems to want to think that there shouldn't be any special class. You shouldn't treat veterans special. But you know, there was a case in 1980 in the Supreme Court of Canada. They said that soldiers, Canadian Forces members, are special. But you know, they weren't special in a good way. Normal laws, human rights stuff, didn't apply. And if you signed up into the military, they could treat you worse. So that was their definition of special. Right? They were talking about the military law system. I forget. Anyway, the point is that people who, they speak on the November 11th, they talk about, a debt of gratitude to the veterans and to the people who die in service. But they don't walk the talk. Right? They ought to be doing everything in their power to help people and not simply change the names of things. Like the income replacement benefit used to be the earnings loss benefit. The permanent impairment allowance became the career impact allowance, became the additional pain and suffering compensation. Right? They keep changing the names. They keep trying to confuse us. They're doing exactly what the insurance industry does. An American book exposed the insurance industry in the 1990s. One of the points that sticks in my head is that they try to confuse and refuse, delay and deny. So somehow they have subverted the idea of insurance, which is supposed to be fair and, treat people right. Because if not, people wouldn't buy insurance. See, they're cutting their nose off to spite their face. If enough people didn't buy insurance, then they wouldn't need to sell it, which means they wouldn't have a business, they wouldn't have employees, and the government would lose taxes. I mean, it will be a mess. So they're not looking at the bigger picture. They're just looking at short-term gain, and they're avoiding the potential punitive damages liability. They're avoiding, they're putting themselves at risk of ridicule, because if the people wake up and see what's happening, the public won't like it. Now, it is a democracy on paper, so we might vote them out. But the thing is, they keep doing it, all the different parties. You can't pin them one different party over another, because they're all doing it whenever they get in power. Listen, on that note, I'll see you next week.